Hi, welcome to another edition of Searching for Sparks. I'm your host, Tim Motzer. And this has been a week all about Jeff Beck and a brand new book called Blow by Blow, written by Brad Tolinski and Chris Gill. And my guest today is Chris Gill, and we're going to find out all about this brand new book and the legendary Jeff Beck. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Tim. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good.
It's good to meet you finally. I've been reading your words for decades.
Oh, cool. Wow.
Yeah, for sure. I was talking to Brad just the other day, and we were kind of like just chatting about, the impact of what you and he have done through Guitar World and Guitar Player, numerous publications and books. And I think it's very massive in terms of how it's affected people. And I can only speak for myself, of course, but.
Cool. Well, sometimes you don't know what it's like out there. Writing sometimes can be, very isolated and you don't really know how the world reacts. I mean, I guess with social media, you see a little bit more immediate stuff. I mean, I kind of get a kick out of some stuff. Like there was a pedal I reviewed back in the mid 90s, the Big Sonic Expandora. It was Japanese and they had these very Japanese instructions on it. And they had these two dip switches in it. And it's like, here's setting one, it's like, fuzz, and this setting's distortion, and then this setting's overdrive, and then this setting is forbidden, do not use, or it said, do not use this setting. So I called it the forbidden setting. And then I saw that pop up in the vernacular about this pedal and everything. I was like, I coined that,
It's amazing, right?
It's kind of weird to see stuff like that happen where it's like, well, I guess I did have an influence. I mean, I wish I had known about some stuff like Digitech Whammy, WH1s, because all the artists I reported on using those, that the prices just started to soar. And it's like, I should have hoarded them before I
before you unleash it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, though. Seriously, I've been, I think going all the way back to age 11, which was probably like 72 or 73. And, that's when I first started reading Guitar Player. So that got me into music journalism, also Circus Magazine back then. And there were a number of publications that were at the checkout counters that I would get as a kid and budding guitar player. And, reading all those interviews over the years really, really informed my life as what I wanted to do. And Jeff Beck got in there really early on. With the album Truth for me. I kind of missed the Yardbirds, but I went back to them. And I was wondering, similarly, when did you get into Jeff Beck?
Yeah, for me, it's an interesting story because I was like you, I started playing, about 10, 11 years old and discovered Guitar Player magazine, probably about 75, 76. And started reading it voraciously. And then, it's like the Old Testament now, I call it, and, of course, this is back before the days of like the really heavy fact checking. So a lot of this stuff has become myth over the years. And that's unfortunately, now we're debunking that. And you have these people but it said so in Guitar Player magazine.
Yeah.
Like saying like, well, there's, that eighth commandment actually is a little wiggly, but anyways, I started reading that. I read Circus Magazine. I used to get it mostly for the pictures, like gear and stuff like that. Like they have all these pictures, like Eddie Van Halen's, Frankenstein guitar, super big and clear and everything like that. So I would get that. But yeah, that really started me off on that whole path. Jeff Beck is an interesting story because I was playing in bands and I knew about Jeff Beck. I heard him on the radio, on FM quite a bit and everything. And, this drummer that was a friend of mine, said like we swapped records back and forth. Unfortunately, he took horrible care of my records. He ruined my Led Zeppelin 2 and my Pat Travers.
No.
One of my Pat Travers albums, but he loaned me Jeff Beck Wired. And so, because I knew tracks, I knew songs that I heard on the radio, but I never heard a whole album. And so that kind of got me going into Jeff Beck. And it's an interesting story because also kind of a backwards way I got into Jeff Beck at the same time was through Aerosmith.
Oh,
and, their version of Train Kept a Rollin'.
Yeah.
And of course I discovered that, well, the Yardbirds, it was based on a recording by the Yardbirds. I'm like, who are these Yardbirds guys? So I went out to the record store and I bought this compilation of Yardbirds tracks. It had Train Kept a Rollin' on it. It's like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I later discovered that the Rock and Roll Trio did it, and then Tiny Bradshaw. And that sent me on this whole side path, you know, because I was kind of this kid into like hard rock and metal and stuff like that growing up. And this set me into rockabilly. And so I started digging up all these old rockabilly songs, saying, well, is there another Train Kept a Rolling out there, you know, that you can take and modify and turn into this really cool riff? But then I ended up becoming really fascinated in rockabilly at the same time that I was, you know, listening to metal and everything like that. And through that, I discovered Cliff Gallup, which brings me full circle back, you know, with Gene Vincent and all that stuff, very jazzy guitar solos like Les Paul and even like Django Reinhardt. And, you know, that brought me back full circle to when I interviewed Jeff Beck, that I had become such a fanatic about Cliff Gallup that I ended up knowing more about Cliff than Jeff knew about. And I also had the ace in my pocket that we had a Rolodex. I was working at Guitar Player Magazine at the time when I interviewed Jeff the first time. And it had Cliff Gallup's phone number in there. Of course, Cliff had passed away many years before that. But I thought, well, I'll call that phone number up and see if I, you know, can reach his widow. And sure enough, she picked up the phone and we had like a good 2-hour conversation. Wow. She told me everything I wanted to know.
Amazing.
Which is funny because Cliff would never himself have given up that information. So she had all kinds of information about, you know, what guitars he still had, you know, what amps he had back in the day. 'Cause she was married to him back in the day and everything. And that's part of the reason why he decided not to go, you know, not to stay with with Gene Vincent very long, because, you know, he didn't like traveling on the road and being away from the family and everything.
Wow.
So he was only, you know, with Gene for like a few months and did like about 30 songs that they recorded, and that was it. So anyways, that's kind of like a roundabout way with Jeff, you know, that,
sure.
You know, I discovered the fusion stuff and that was pretty much an FM staple. You heard it all the time and everything.
Yeah.
Like that. And I dug it, but you know, the Yardbirds stuff was like, that's really cool, you know, because it's kind of, it's almost punk rock, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you know, there's so many tangents we could jump off on, you know, about Jeff, but one of the things, Brad kindly sent me his transcripts of the book, and I don't have a copy yet, but I see the cover behind you. If you want to hold that up at any point in time, you can.
I'll save it for later.
Yeah. And one of the things that blew me out, well, throughout the whole book, really, but firstly, I want to say it's a definitive book on Jeff, and I've read a few of his books, and I've been a super fan forever. But some things about the Yardbirds that I just never knew. I mean, you really filled in a lot of gaps. And as I was talking to Brad, I was saying, you guys were detectives. You know, you really pulled some deep stuff out. And how do you and Brad actually work together to sleuth all of this material?
Well, we pretty much divvied up certain segments of time, you know, and Brad took on like the early years and the Yardbirds. I mean, some of the stuff like in the first chapter is a little bit of both of us. Okay. Because I had done that interview with Jeff about, you know, about Cliff Gallup. So we talked about his early days, but then, you know, Brad also had this really great co-interview between Jeff and Jimmy Page. So that covered a lot of territory too. So I kind of had Jeff talking about, you know, what the Gene Vincent music and the Cliff Gallup stuff meant to him, and a lot of great stuff about his early bands. Unfortunately, there was one great quote in there that got chopped because I think Brad didn't quite get it, but I loved the humor of it because it was kind of like a typical Jeff Beck, you know, I'm going to get a dig in at this guy. But the band that he was in was the Deltones, you know, initially, and it was Johnny Dell and the Deltones. Wow. And the guy's name was actually Derek Birchall. And Jeff said, like, oh, you know, it was at this time, and you know, it was the early 60s, and they didn't want to do Gene Vincent stuff anymore. They wanted to do all this V-neck sweater music, you know, with you know, all this crooning and stuff like that. And Elvis, you know, didn't even want to do the Elvis stuff. They wanted to do like his latest Flame and all this other stuff. You know, and he was lamenting that, and he says, like, you know, and they would play all this stuff, and all the girls would go, oh, Derek, or whatever his name was. You know, and I thought that was such a dig because it's like, you know, I didn't really, he's inferring that he didn't care to remember the guy's name, and B, it's like, well, because the guy went by Johnny Dell, so, you know, Derek or whatever his name he was calling himself, you know, as a stage performer. So, but yeah, we that stuff got divvied up, you know, and we would add each other, we would find stuff along the way and say like, hey, check this out, this will add to what you're doing. You know, and so we all had our little discoveries. It was just, I mean, it was a lot of digging. We went through all these books, and some of them are very good, but the problem is that, a lot of stuff is just, they don't go further. And it's like, I would question dates about things always. It was kind of funny because I would love to talk with Jan Hammer more about this, but because he claims that he met Jeff in Montreux, Switzerland, when he was on tour with Mahavishnu. And Jeff said that, oh yeah, I met Jan in Montreux, Switzerland, and they both, you think that's ironclad. They both recall meeting in Montreux, but I looked up their tour dates, and it's impossible. Mahavishnu was in Montreux. They were way up in like Finland or something like that. Beck Bogert and the Peace were on tour. They were up somewhere in the far northern European, and there's no way that time whatever that they could have crossed paths. Now, Carmen Apice remembers going to see, Mahavishnu in Paris. And that was like, and that lines up. It's like, because Beck, Bogert, and Apice played the first night. And then, and Carmen says, like, we stayed over, additional day to catch Mahavishnu. And of course, sure enough, Mahavishnu plays the next day in Paris. That lines up. So maybe they mixed up Paris in their mind and thought it was somehow Montreux, or maybe Montreux sounded cooler than Paris. I don't know. Yeah. But that was kind of an interesting thing, because, you would go and look this up. And of course, now we have all this wonderful information out there that you can verify stuff. But it also makes it a bit of a headache, because then you have to check everything, But that was a big part of the process, was all this detective work, was really just, checking everything and making sure that if someone mentioned a certain date, verify it. Yeah.
Well, it's really, when I think about Jeff Beck, such a legend, and to have you guys on the case, you're historians really of, and the archive that I imagine you have in terms of interviews with Jeff, as well as all the people that surrounded him that are still around. That's a pretty important archive for guitar players and aficionados and people that love Jeff. So fantastic work.
Yeah, thank you. It's, and that was the other part, was going out and doing the new interviews that we did, because we had questions, and it's like, how do we fill in the pieces? And there was a few cases where we couldn't reach certain people, but then there's other people that we didn't expect to deliver such amazing goods. Simon Phillips, for me, was just a revelation.
Oh, great.
He filled in so many holes, and there was stuff I never knew about before.
Yeah.
Even any of the books don't mention this at all. It's because Jeff wasn't doing any press. And so these were things that had come and gone. There was an album project with Bob Ezrin producing that we never heard of before. Wow. And it was like, wow. And it was a great story on top of it. It's hilarious. I thought it was one of the most funny episodes in the book, was him talking about, this failed project with Bob Ezrin, because it was so bad on all these fronts, between, Ezrin wanting to do, this certain, Broadway show tune style of music, to Tony Hymas showing up and refusing to play anything but a monophonic guitar. And he refused to play any chords on the keyboard. He was just like, no, I'm going to play this monophonic guitar, and that's it.
That's when he was into like electronic stuff, right?
Yes. Yeah. That period. Yeah. He had his pop band PhD that had a few like hits over in Europe.
He was amazing. Like this morning, I watched a little bit. I found on YouTube a concert that was Pino, Palladino, and Terry on drums, and Tony. I'm not sure where it was from. I want to say Denver or something, but wow. It was amazing to see that. It wasn't great quality or anything, but just, them coming out and ripping. It was killing. And I guess that was, I'm not sure what tour that was, but it might have been opening for Santana.
Right. It was probably 95, because that was the lineup with Pino on bass. And I saw 6, 7, 8 shows on that tour. I was like following the Dead, it's like a Deadhead.
I would have done that.
I saw like every show in California. So unfortunately I was in really tight. I got in pretty tight with Jeff after that first interview, actually. But his manager, Ralph Baker, always took care of me. So I shot a lot of photos. In fact, there's one photo from that tour that I shot in the book. But yeah, I would follow him around. I saw all the Bay Area shows, the LA shows, San Diego, everything in California, basically.
Wow. So when did you first meet Jeff, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, that was on the Crazy Legs project, and also Frankie's house. It was a double header. double feature, so to speak. But I had just started working full time for Guitar Player magazine. I had worked for doing artist relations for Roland Corporation before that, so I knew a lot of artists. And somehow I ended up at my dream job at Guitar Player. Like you, I read the magazine, and that was just always like, I never thought I would get a job there. In fact, I tried to enter through the advertising side. That was my first contact with them. And I actually got offered a job, writing for them because they had read my writing for the Roland User Group magazine. And so I freelanced for a little while, then got hired full time and went up there. And Jeff was like the top of my list. There was two people, basically, Eddie Van Halen and Jeff Beck, that were at the top of my list of people to interview. And my opportunity to interview Jeff came up first. And it was perfect because I found out he was going to be doing this rockabilly record, this tribute to Cliff Gallup.
Yeah.
And I was a little bit cocky. I talked to Ralph Baker. I got him on the phone, and he's like, and so Ralph's like, "Oh, so you think you know a lot about Cliff Gallup? Well, what amp did he use?" And I said, "Oh, he had a little old Fender Tweed amp." He's like, "Oh, you're wrong, because he said in your magazine that it was this Standell amp that belonged to Grady Martin." It's like, well, that's what he used for later sessions, but initially, and when he was off with the band, his main amp was this Fender Tweed. He's like, "How do you know that?" And I said, like, I spoke with his widow, and she told me everything. Wow. And the funny thing is that, I was going off what she said, and she didn't know what model it was. Just, it was this tan colored Fender amplifier was all she could say. Funnily enough, a photo turned up just a few years ago of the first session that Cliff Gallup did at the Quonset hut out there. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who had it, but it was like and there was this little Fender Tweed amp. Sure enough. And then it's like, and he was the only amplified instrument in Gene Vincent's band, so it was his amp. And it was like, wow, I hope Jeff saw this. I really hope that Jeff saw this before he passed away, because it was like, there it is. There's the absolute definitive proof. And it's like, I think what happened was, the story goes that, Cliff Gallup showed up, the whole Gene Vincent band showed up. He brought his whole performing band with him. And the typical thing was like, we'll keep the singer, but then we'll take all the Nashville, hot, session players to back these guys up. Because usually the guys that were in these bands were okay, but they weren't really all that seasoned.
Yeah.
And so anyways, they set up with Gene and his band, and they hear Cliff play, and they just go, "Send the session guys home." This guy's, he's better than our guys, it's like, but I think what happened was just when, they drove out from like the Newport News area of Virginia to Nashville, which isn't too far of a drive. But I think that, after those first sessions, Cliff just brought his guitar. So, because they returned to Nashville to do more sessions. And then he just used Grady Martin Standell. He didn't need to bring his Fender with him. He just figured, I'll just bring my guitar because I'm comfortable with that, but I'll plug in any old amp,
Yeah.
So that's what he did. So anyways, I had this whole thing, and he kind of busted me, and Ralph was kind of fascinated that he heard that I'd spoken with the widow and everything like that. So he says like, "Okay, well, we'll have you out." So, awesome. About 10 days before Christmas, 92, I fly out to England, and I go to Jeff's house. That's the cool thing. And then in the intro of the book, I won't spoil it, but I kind of talk about what happened, because it didn't really quite go as planned initially. But it turned into this wonderful experience. I spent 3 days hanging out with Jeff. The first day at his house with him and Sandra, and Jed Lieber was actually out there as well. And that was just a good, afternoon tea, hang out with the dogs and the cats and everything at this beautiful old, house built in 1511 or 1512 or whatever it was, with no central heating and no electricity, at least downstairs. I know he had upstairs for his studio and for his amplifiers and guitars and all that, but the bottom floor was like, he wanted to keep it like it was in original, the 1500s. But then the next day we did the photo shoot, and he was recording at Comfort's Place Studio, doing tracks for the Paul Rogers Muddy Water Blues.
Wow.
So I got to watch him work then, and then I came back the next day to watch him work again, and then had dinner with him that evening, and then, took off and spent the rest of the week, hanging out in London. But it was a great experience. He was tough at first, but it broke the ice immediately. Especially with all the info that I had about Cliff for him, that got me a big in with him. And
cool.
Ralph pulled me aside and said, like, he really enjoyed talking with you, because you really, you offered him something like a lot of other writers have said they knew stuff about Cliff Gallup, but Jeff always knew more. And like, you were the first person who came with, new stuff for him. And ever since then, I had a really good relationship with him. Maybe it was kind of odd because there was a 99 when he did his comeback, with Who Else. We had a very long discussion at this hotel called the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington. And it was very personal. And I was really quite amazed, like how candid he was with me in that interview. And, you do a lot of these interviews with artists and they kind of say the same, they do the same interview with everybody.
Yeah.
And they different questions, same answers. Eddie Van Halen was like that a lot of times. But this was like, I read this thing, and this was for a Japanese magazine. It kind of bummed me out because I thought, wow, I got this really revealing interview out of Jeff, and it's unlike anything else that he did in the press for this record. And so we kind of had that bond. And even when it came time when he was doing his semi-autobiographical book for Genesis Publications, the Hot Rods and Rock and Roll, which is really about, his musical career. Oh, there you go. That's the one. Yeah. So he hired me to write the information on his guitars.
Wow.
Yeah. So
those are all your descriptions in there?
Yeah, those are all my descriptions on all the guitar information. Yeah. So
wow.
Yeah. So, but well, it was good. And it was great. I talked with him. I did about 5, 6, 7 long interviews with him, and probably about 20 little short, it could be anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes about, some project he was working on. There was like the Hendrix project Hendrix tribute that he did. I followed up with him on the Muddy Waters thing. Even when, when Mobile Fidelity remastered Blow by Blow. It was funny because Mobile Fidelity hired me to do these, to contribute to the liner notes. I didn't know it at the time. I thought they hired me to write liner notes, right? So I figured, well, I'll just call Jeff up and do an interview, on Blow by Blow. And and got that, and I turned this thing in. And I didn't, when I got the things, it's like they just cut out this little paragraph with some of these quotes from Jeff that I got, and everything else was just writers talking about their impression of the record, and whatever.
Yeah.
This kind of like a little summary of it or whatever. And it's like, oh wow, I completely misunderstood the assignment, but hey, I got a blow by blow interview out of Jeff out of it. So what the heck?
Man, you've had like the dream hangs to hang with Jeff and talk to him deeply about guitar and life and all those things. Oh,
it was. I mean, that first, again, going to his house, that was just like a dream come true. And that was like, what a way to start my career.
My goodness.
I mean, it wasn't the first thing I had done, but it was pretty early on. I'd been doing it for maybe about a year or so as, a full-fledged guitar writer, journalist. But yeah, I go to Jeff's house, and we're sitting there, and he's got this old 56 Gretsch Duojet that he just found. It unfortunately didn't make it on the record, but it was closer to the one that Cliff Gallup had than the one that he used to record the record with. And since I was in rockabilly bands, it's like, it's a perfect opportunity. It's like he just handed me the guitar to check it out, and I said, I do the Race with the Devil solo like this. He's like, well, that's close, but I do it like this, and so we did this kind of passing the guitar back and forth, like a guitar lesson.
Fun
type of deal. And it's like, God, that was it for me. It's like, here I am, swapping a guitar with Jeff Beck. Imagine that,
Does it get better than that? I don't know. Maybe not.
and this is the thing too. And people say this all the time, but it's really true. It's like, Jeff and Eddie Van Halen are like, two of these guys that unplugged. I've sat there, feet away from them with unplugged guitars, and it's 90-95% of their sound. It's just right there on an unplugged guitar, and the amp just makes it bigger. Yeah.
Brad was talking about his interview with Jimmy Page and Jeff, and how Jeff, I guess for the photo shoot, Jeff had his guitar Strat, maybe the white Strat, and Jimmy Page had his Les Paul, and Jeff the whole time was just ripping it up.
Yeah.
And he looked at Jimmy or something like that and said, "Your turn." And I think Jimmy just said, "No, it's okay." I give up or something like that, and it's kind of like what a guitar player does. If it's in your hands, you're constantly playing, right?
Yeah. Well, Jeff in particular was, he had guitars all over the house, and that's one thing that's, was a myth about him. And that's what I got from people, girlfriends and, people who knew him very well on a day-to-day basis. There's this whole myth that, Jeff would disappear and go work on his hot rods, for a while. And it's like, yeah, he would work on hot rods, but the music was always there. He'd go out and bust his knuckles, on an engine block, and then come in and then pick up his Strat and start playing.
Yeah.
There was one girlfriend I talked to, this was after the book came out, but she mentioned like she would serve him, dinner, and he would sit there, with the guitar in his lap, and like eat with one hand and like be fretting on, with his left hand, then put the spoon down or whatever, the fork and whatever, and just keep playing, and you play while he was eating even. It was just constant.
It reminds me of some of the Jimi Hendrix stories I've read as well. Like Jimi supposedly was that way. Guitar was always around his neck, especially in the early days, I guess.
Yeah. And that's, you can understand that's why he maintained his talent up until the very end.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. You don't see many people that, usually they start to lose it a little bit at the end. And sadly, Eddie Van Halen didn't live, that long. But he was great up until the very end. In fact, I think that 2015 tour, I think he was playing better than he had in years.
Well, I would say the same about Jeff. To me, it just seemed like he kept evolving. And even if some of the material was some that he might have done the tour before, to hear his take on it that particular night was a whole new thing. And it just kept evolving and getting better, I felt, Well,
that's what was amazing to me. That's why I went to go see him so many times in 95 in particular. I saw him a lot after, before and after that. But 95, I really concentrated and went to like all these shows one after the other. And to see how much he went on a tightrope walk every night.
Yeah.
It was just like he would go off somewhere. And, we even talked about it where it was just like, sometimes I'll just go off somewhere and, I might fail. But then the other night I might go somewhere amazing. And it's just, it was worth it to him to take that risk. And just to, do something a little bit different. And it's fascinating. Even working on the book, it's like, you listen to a lot of these live albums that he did. Like there was a period in the 2000s where he did, several live albums in session, and a lot of them have the same material on them. And you're like, you don't think about it at the time because, several years pass, like, okay, you get this live album, then you get the next one a couple years later. But when you go back all these years and like listen to him one after the other, then you can hear like, oh, okay, now I see why he included the same song on all these albums. Like Brush with the Blues is on, like, not only is it on Who Else, but it's also on these other records. Yeah. And it's like, oh, okay, now I get why he did this,
It's the way he would articulate melodies. Like, he was really a singer to me in a way, he loved melody without a doubt. That was his thing, and he loved a great song, right? And it's just something he could really get his teeth into.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is that, you listen to something like, say, Freeway Jam, or even Blue Wind, and you say, like, that melody is kind of simple. It's kind of simplistic. It's like, yeah, it is, but try and play it like Jeff.
Yeah.
Because Simon Phillips had this great story where, they were working on There and Back, and him and Tony Hymas had written, the song for Jeff, and Jeff's like, okay, give me a minute, and so they're sitting in the front room having tea, and they can hear Jeff working on this thing, and then like going, what's the problem? It's so simple, and then they realized, oh, wait, he's working on like the perfect, where the perfect note to play on which string and how to play that note and everything. And it was just like the fine details that he went into. It was really like, it may be a simple melody, but he had to figure out the way to make that sound its absolute best.
Yeah, that's really an interesting point about guitar, because it's a difficult instrument, really, because of just what you just said. You could play a line on a number of set of strings across the neck, but where does it work the best, and where does it set it up the best? And I love hearing those details in the book about, how much time he would spend just to craft something and find it. He was dedicated, he was into it, and then there was so much deep intention to his playing, and yet he seemed to be frustrated as well many times, and would just give up bands and I'm done with this and on to the next thing, whatever that is.
Very much so. He was his own worst critic. That was the other amazing revelation in his book. We all heard about some of these lost albums, and I knew about some things like the Steve Lukather album. I was actually interviewing Lukather at the time when he was working on that album with Jeff, and I was able to incorporate some of that material into the book because that was when it was fresh, when Luke was right in the middle of working on it. And that stuff had never been released before because we were just talking about it as fanboys, basically. Yeah. Like I was calling up Lukather to talk about this solo album that he did, but it's like, hey, Luke's like, I'm working on an album with Jeff Beck. And so we ended up talking like a half hour about, the Jeff Beck project. But it was, he would work on these things and abandon them. And he'd start off with the band and switch directions. Again, a couple of these things. I know sometimes something he mentioned in passing. And it's like, well, wait a second. Like I went back and because when I interviewed him, when was that? It was probably 99 or 2001, and probably was 99. But he talked about a band that he had with Terry Bozzio and the Peter Gabriel bass player.
Tony Levin,
and Terry Bozzio and Jennifer Batten.
Wow. I didn't know Tony was involved ever.
It was a very, very short period. And they did a couple rehearsals. And then Terry thought that Jeff wasn't taking it seriously. And Terry had been burned enough by Jeff that he just said, I'm taking off. And Tony's like, me too. But it's like, gosh, I wish I could have heard that,
Wow.
That was interesting. Stuff with John Paul Jones in 1980 on bass, around the there and back period. That's been recorded, but unfortunately may have been lost forever because Jeff had tapes in his house that the house got flooded. And the tapes got destroyed, and he didn't want them released anyways. And so Sandra, his widow, probably would never release them anyways. And then Simon Phillips had backups of those tapes, but then his house burned down in a fire a few years back.
I remember that.
Yeah, and so those tapes, Simon's not 100% certain, but he's pretty sure that those tapes got lost then too. But there's all these things out there, and it was just fascinating that the stuff that he didn't do was as fascinating as the stuff that he did do, and the what ifs, the possibilities, what could have been. I mean, a record with Stuart Copeland. It goes on and on of all these amazing projects.
Possibilities.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said a little while ago was talking about listening to different versions of tunes live. And, it made me think about the different bands that I saw him play with. And I know you've seen him many times. And one of my favorite bands is always when, Vinny was on drums.
Oh, yeah.
Because it just seemed like if Rhonda was playing bass and Vinny was there, or Tal, he would jump off the cliff. And he really didn't seem to be worried too much because Vinny had him. Vinny was setting him up all the time. And he was always spinning around to look at Vinny like, where are we? True. He would jump off the bridge, Oh,
yeah.
And I think that's one of the things we love about Jeff is he really would jump off.
Yeah, he never played it safe. That's the thing. He never played it safe. And that's musically, I mean, the so-called Electronica trilogy, records was just like, I mean, he went from, with Lukather, he was doing more of a straightforward type of fusion record for the most part. And I think Jeff just kind of felt like, I kind of been down this path and he just wasn't feeling it, and all this electronic music was exploding at the time, starting around 96 or so. And, was breaking through to the mainstream, especially over in England, but a bit in the United States too. And he was really excited about those sounds. And that's the funny thing about him too, is that, it wasn't like he was really hopping on a trend so much, but that he had a genuine love for this stuff. And
he was into it.
A record back in like 1960, 61 that, I think Jimmy Page had it. And it was Tom Dissevelt and Kid Alton. And this Dutch duo in this electronic music record, and that he was listening to as a kid and saying, I was just fascinated by this stuff. And, he always kind of kept that. And, I think the thing about Jeff is he listened to more music beyond the guitar than he listened to other guitarists play. And he found inspiration from that.
Yeah. I think it was in your book as well, where he talked about how much Jan Hammer influenced how he would bend notes and things like that. Like he really influenced him a lot.
Yeah, that's you can see when that starts to show up, and it's funny because it almost musically it backs up what Jeff's story was, because he talks about getting into fusion basically in 1970 with Miles Davis and the Johnson record with McLaughlin on guitar, and he was he had wrecked his hot rod, this T-bucket hot rod, and, almost killed himself.
Man.
And he was restoring it, and he had the radio on, and he hears this music, and like, and saying like, yeah, I just had to stop what I was doing and go in and listen to this record, on the radio. And, Carmen Apice says that, I introduced, Jeff to Mahavishnu and everything like that. And it's like, well, not really, because you can hear like the Jan Hammer thing starting to appear in the Beck, Bogert, and Apice stuff. And even some of the Jeff Beck group, stuff, you can start to hear it coming in, a bit. And of course he goes full fledged with it, with blow by blow, but it was bubbling under. And that's the thing, is that he would have these things, and he would just keep them in his back pocket for a while, and then when the time was right, it's like, okay, now I want to go in this direction finally.
Yeah. It's like, and those records, Truth and Beckola, are just astounding blueprints for so many bands, right?
Yeah.
And including Jimmy Page's band, Led Zeppelin. I think.
Definitely.
And Peter Grant, and that whole story was amazing to read, because that really filled in a lot of holes for me, just seeing how that all worked out with Mickey Most and stuff. I think readers are really going to love reading that transitional moment, and why Led Zeppelin succeeded, really, and why the Jeff Beck group maybe did not,
Yeah. It's interesting, because that's, I think the thing too, is that, we have read the other books and this stuff out there, and it's all very, Jeff did this and Jeff did that and Jeff did this. And it was like, but why did these things happen? Why did stuff work this way? What was going on musically at the time and everything? The fact that they tried to turn Jeff into a pop star, but that was the thing to do. And I've read these other things talking about, well, Jeff did these albums with the Yardbirds. Well, the Yardbirds weren't really an album band. I mean, with Jeff, they did one album. They put together these compilations, but they were compilations of singles and live recordings, and they were packaged as albums, but they weren't like, we weren't going in like the Beatles and doing an album, it was just like that. And that was kind of typical. Even the Rolling Stones had a lot of that, and even the Beatles had, stuff that was packaged together. That wasn't really like an actual Beatles album. It was just like, for the American market, we're going to put these things together with these singles and fill it in with these songs from this album and whatever. But yeah, the Yardbirds really weren't an album-oriented band, and even when Jeff did Beck's Bolero and, and Hi-Ho Silver Lining, and these other things, they were working on him as kind of this pop artist, Tally Man and stuff like that, trying to make him into this pop artist. And, he still wasn't an album artist yet. Of course, he does Truth, and that becomes an album, and he becomes an album artist from then on, basically. But there was that period there where that was the 60s, though. And that's, people have to understand that it was the norm, that really singles kind of drove business more than album sales did at that point. And then we reached the 70s, where it switched around and people were really interested in full-length albums and less so in singles.
Well, we were there, FM radio, right?
Yeah, FM radio. Yeah.
And when FM first started, it was pretty astounding, as I recall, because it was so free form early on. And I was growing up in Ohio and near Cincinnati, and they had a great radio station there, WEBN, and also Oxford, Ohio, at a college radio station. They were playing album sides, full albums all the time. Yeah. And I heard so much stuff because of that. And, maybe we forget about how important FM radio used to be.
Oh, it was mammoth for me. It was like, I lived in northern San Diego County, and I was in this sweet spot in between Los Angeles and San Diego.
Nice.
And then we also had like the Inland Empire with San Bernardino. So I had like this triangle of stations, and actually on top of that, you had the pirate radio stuff going on down in Mexico.
Wow,
and that was really cool, because
what was that like?
Oh man, it was really like the Wild West, of these guys that would just play whatever, like there was, pretty much FM radio was like that anyways. They would play whatever. There was a playlist. Every station had its own personality. I remember the San Bernardino station. The early ZZ Top stuff,
that makes sense.
ZZ Top albums constantly. You never heard that stuff, on, you might hear stuff from, Tres Hombres or whatever on, some of the other, the beach stations, so to speak, San Diego and LA stations, but San Bernardino was like hardcore with that. But yeah, it was just, there was stuff like, San Diego KGB would play more punk rock. in the early days of punk rock. You would hear more of that type of stuff, more shows that they had, even special shows that they played that kind of stuff.
That's cool.
KMET was like, and KLOS were a little bit more the hard rock,
Yeah.
kind of focus, a little bit of hippie rock, and everything, and stoner rock, Pink Floyd and stuff like that,
Wow.
But yeah, it was great to grow up. I mean, it was, and nowadays, it started to happen in the 80s where everything became formatted, and there was like one major overlord saying, this is what you're going to play. This is the playlist, and, you lost that sense of adventure and everything became homogenized.
Yeah, it was too bad. And now where are we? That's a question. Where are we right now with music? Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I think it's an interesting time because you just have to do much more hard work.
Yeah.
Which is funny because I worked for Digital Design for a brief in-between period. I worked doing artist relations for Digital Design and Pro Tools. And Jerry Harrison and I often would meet up and have lunch. And
cool.
This was the days that, when Napster was just starting, to make a big fuss, and digital files and downloading and everything. And Digital Design was considering, actually they bought this like what's called IUMA, the International Underground Music Association. It was like based in Santa Cruz. Unfortunately, most of the music that was on there wasn't very good. And I was, unfortunately, Apple beat us to the punch because I wanted to do what Apple did with iTunes, basically, was just like, open up this whole music distribution system, especially at that period. There was one of many different recording industry lulls going on, and a bunch of artists got dropped. And they were on major labels, and it was artists like the Reverend Horton Heat, for example, and it's like, okay, Reverend Horton Heat maybe isn't going to release a gold or a platinum album anymore, but they still have a sizable audience.
Yeah.
And like, let's make this stuff available, let's go after these guys, these
important artists
track record. But anyway, that's off the story. But Jerry was talking about a filter, and that's what FM radio was, and even AM radio and radio in general is a filter, tastemakers. We pick this stuff and we decide. That's kind of the problem when you have this whole wide open world of stuff out there like we have now.
Yeah.
Is that how do we find stuff, how, and an algorithm may not necessarily be the best thing to, it's better to get from a human, a better idea of like, they might turn you on to something that you may not have ever been aware of, and an algorithm wouldn't have found based on your prior tastes,
Yeah. And, like DJ culture too, like I'm thinking late 90s, right? I mean, it existed before then, but late 90s into the 2000s, that was a big boom, and that introduced all kinds of new music to people. But you had to go to the clubs, pretty much.
Which is interesting because it's like, I was deep in that too. I did a magazine called Remix that I was the editor of for about 3 years. And,
I used to buy those.
I was in, the clubs constantly.
Yeah.
I have those records and everything like that. And it's interesting because it's like, there were hits, but they weren't huge. And unfortunately what killed, that side of things, unfortunately, was digital downloading. I knew many artists who could reliably sell 50 to 100,000 copies of a record. And once, downloading, free downloading of stuff via like Napster and whatever started to really take hold with people, they saw their record sales drop dramatically, to like 5 or 10,000. And it wasn't that the quality of the records was bad or anything. It's just that people buying them. And a lot of these people just dropped out and quit because it wasn't financially viable for them anymore. So that really hurt.
Yeah, that fills in some holes for me because I really felt like 97, 98, 99.
Yeah.
All this new music was about ready to burst onto the mainstream, and it didn't. It just did not. And I was like, what happened?
Yeah. Well, there was artists like these guys I knew in LA, the duo called Deep Sky, and they had one record and they had a big following and it did really well. They did another record and it tanked. But I saw this happen across the board with people. This German artist, Timo Maas, he had some pretty big club hits and everything. And then he did this record and it tanked, and it's like, and I just saw everybody was like, their records weren't selling.
It was weird. It's a weird time.
Really weird. Yeah, it was a crisis, and unfortunately, you were dealing with a younger audience and they were very tech savvy and they didn't realize that by downloading this stuff, they were killing the music that they loved.
Yeah. And prior to Napster, I think Zappa had talked to labels about that idea. I think Todd Rundgren talked to labels about that idea, and they weren't interested at that time.
The labels were the furthest away from that, and when did it took Apple basically to blow that wide open, and everything. But yeah, bringing this back to Jeff though was just interesting because it's like, I think the first record, Who Else, was a failed attempt at that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I had, again, it was one of those things, why didn't I put two and two together at the time? Because when I interviewed Jeff, I was when I was doing artist relations at Digital Design, and I was hired by Player Magazine in Japan to go out there and interview him. And, I was like listening to the record and going like, it just doesn't sound as electronica as Jeff wants it to sound. And like, what's wrong with it? And I remember him talking about artists that he loved, like The Prodigy and Chemical Brothers. And it was so funny because on that same trip that I went to interview Jeff, I was invited by the Chemical Brothers to go out to this club called Turnmills, and they were going to be debuting some tracks from their upcoming album, at their DJ gig that night. And I went back and listened to that particular album that came out alongside Jeff's album, Who Else? And I realized it's like, he screwed up. He didn't get the bass. He didn't get the bass right. It doesn't have the bottom end. It's a very guitar player record. It's very mid-range heavy and everything like that. And then you switch over to the Chemical Brothers. It's like, oh my gosh, it's just the sound just expands.
Subs.
Jeff's record's so focused. Yeah, it's subs and it's these big trebles and all this ear candy and stuff. Whereas Jeff was still making kind of a traditional rock record.
Yeah.
And he got that later on. The next two records, he got a proper, producer to do that, and then the sounds start to come, and it starts to become more of that, and
I think it was on the album Jeff that he worked with David Torn as well to kind of chop up and remix a couple pieces.
Right, yeah. And Torn, that Jeff was actually the record I think where he accomplished that. Was it Jeff? I guess, yeah, it was Jeff because but that was the third one. That's where he really got the formula right, And he'd worked with Andy Wright on the album before that, and he worked with Andy Wright on Jeff as well. But then they also brought in these other people. Apollo 440 came in as well. And there's a couple other collaborators. And yeah, the David Torn stuff I really love because it's like, that's
fantastic. That
was where I think Jeff found like, the right guy where, because Torn comes from a jazz background and everything, but he's also very experimental and, very electronic savvy. And that was just like the right thing. And it would have been great if they could have just done an entire album together.
I totally agree. I think there was a third track mentioned in the book.
There is a third track, and actually
it didn't happen or something.
It did happen. Torn had said it was too late, but it actually came out in Japan.
Ah, really?
So yeah, I found that out after the fact. That
have you heard it?
I have heard it. Yeah, it's not quite as good as I can see where Torn's a little critical of it, but it's not quite as good as the first two, but it's still good.
Ran out of time, maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's what Torn said. They ran out of time. He was rushed and he did it. And I think in Japan, you always have to have on a CD. I don't know if it's still the law over there or not, but you have to have an unreleased track
right
on a release over there. So all these Japan releases have all these, extra bonus tracks on them.
Wow.
And that's what they put as the bonus track on Jeff in Japan.
Yeah, I'll have to look for that and find it somewhere.
Yeah, Discogs, you'll find it. So whether the price is good or not, that's the big question at the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes wait a little bit,
Well, thanks for talking about the trilogy of the electronic stuff, because I always wondered about those three albums, and they were really evolving to that final one. And then as I was talking to Brad the other day, it's like after those records, Jeff started zigzagging again, right?
Yeah, he started zigzagging. I think that was one of the things, because unfortunately those records did horribly commercially. And amazing. As I mentioned in the book, it's not entirely Jeff's fault, because there was Napster and WinMX and all this other stuff, and
same problems.
And he was going through the same problems that all these other artists were going, were having. And so, yes, the sales were not great. It's kind of the problem he had similar to that in the 80s. I think a lot of people don't realize. I knew because I was in the middle of that. Was my first job was working at a record label in the early 80s. And there was this Black Friday that people forget about, where Columbia, CBS, Columbia, Sony, that whole family laid off like about 300, 400 people. And that really sent shockwaves through the industry at the time. And records weren't selling. at that point. They were selling, but they weren't selling as well as they had previously. And, they were counting, the labels were, especially Sony, Columbia, was counting on these major artists to deliver the goods, and they didn't. And so that kind of sent everything into a tailspin of sorts. And, and Jeff was under pressure, and it's like, we need you to, There and Back didn't do so hot, Jeff. We need you to avoid, get out of this fusion thing and do something else, and they set him with Nile Rodgers. And that's, again, if you just say, well, Jeff did this and Jeff did that, you kind of miss what was really going on, and that's hard to make sense of that. Like, why did Sony, and of course we had Greg Gelman as well, who gave us a lot of illuminating behind the scenes information, what was really going on with Jeff's career, because otherwise, how did he go from There and Back to Flash?
Yeah.
There's a reason why that happened. It just wasn't a whim.
Well, it was kind of like, in a strange way for me, like going for the Motown records that he did, the Jeff Beck Group and Rough and Ready, into Beck, Bogart, and Appice, or Appice, however you say his name.
Yeah.
And then Blow by Blow, where to me, the chronological order should have been Motown to Blow by Blow, but there's this heavy metal funk record in the middle, kind of.
Yeah. And I think that was Jeff kind of going
scheduling or whatever.
I think it was kind of, the automobile accident derailed him. And because that was going to be his next move, was to do Beck, Bogart, and I say Appice because that's the way Carmen says it. So
okay, Appice.
It took me years because it used to be Appice, and I thought the same thing. But then Carmen says it's Carmen Appice. So
okay, good to know.
The guy should know how his own name is said, but but yeah, that's what he was going to do. And then he had about a year off, recovering from this accident, and then decided, well, those guys moved on, basically, and they formed Cactus. And so Jeff had to kind of wait, and then they were available. And then I think he decided, like, well, let's see if that would have worked after all, and it did okay, but not, again, to the expectations that anybody had. And I think Jeff at the same time felt like, yeah, this is probably a couple of years too late, like if I had done this in 1970, it probably would have been a big deal, but, doing it in 72, 73, 74, really 73, 74, it's a little bit behind the times, it felt like to him. So, but yeah, it's interesting because it's just, I think that's one of the few cases where he did kind of fall a little bit behind the curve, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the final book, but I have a feeling that you got into his guitars and maybe his gear a little bit. And I was just curious, like, what your perspective was on the gear that he was using maybe in the last few years before he passed, what his stage rigs were and the kind of gear he was using. And I think he was still using his white Stratocaster, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, well, he had a number of white Stratocasters. I mean, we do actually have a whole section in the back that kind of breaks down his guitars by, like, okay, Telecasters and Esquires, and then there's what I call the wired Strats, which is a whole different story. That's a fascinating thing because he had a mid 60s one that John McLaughlin gave him as a gift, and then that ended up getting stolen when he came out to New York to record with Jan Hammer.
Wow.
And then he had a 70s white Strat at the same time that he had since the early 70s. That got stolen too. And then he bought this replacement, early 60s one that he actually had till the end of his career. And what I didn't realize until the Christie's auction actually was that there's, when he's in Japan, you've seen the pictures of him with this white Strat with a black pickguard on it, and it's a Schecter pickguard assembly that he has with switches instead of it has 3 individual switches for each pickup as opposed to a toggle switch. But that's the same. That's the early 60s one. He just put a different pickguard assembly on it.
Wow.
But yeah, we got into that quite a bit. I think the latter years in particular was a mishmash of things. It was like kind of a variety of stuff he had used throughout the various years because he was pretty much a minimalist guy for most of his career. Yardbirds, he had, a fuzz box, and, Jeff Beck Group, first edition, he had the wah-wah pedal and the fuzz and an overdrive. And then we see him, kind of moving on to color sound overdriver and the bag talk box.
Yeah, right.
And he has these octave pedals. That was the thing about the book, because initially I had written some articles for Guitar World about saying that, oh, Jeff had used this and I got it wrong, because it's like I didn't do my due diligence and figure out that the timeline didn't line up for when, because I think I said he used a Mutron octave divider, and that actually hadn't been invented by that point yet. But he had a color sound octave box, and he did have a Dan Armstrong green ringer, which you can hear on Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. That gives you that really abrasive,
Oh yeah.
kind of tones that he puts in there. But as it gets on later, then of course Guitar Shop, it's like a Rat distortion and a Boss DD3, but that's it. Still it's still pretty minimalist. And then you get into these latter years, and he has all these pedals. He has a big, huge pedal board, but he's bringing all this stuff to basically make all these sounds. He brings an old original Maestro ring modulator, which he used. He had that. Like I think Jan Hammer had actually given it to him, but he actually used that on You Had It Coming, and Jeff on those albums. He used that to get these really dissonant sound textures out of it. But he had that on his board and all these other things. That was just octave boxes, various distortion and overdrives, and everything. And it was fascinating to see that he'd gone from this minimalist thing to this maximalist, almost like, okay. But I think it was just because like I've got so many songs for my career now that I'm covering, and I wanted to do them right. Yeah.
And primarily he was using Marshalls for the most of it, right? Most of his career.
For the most part, yeah. But it's interesting because that was the stage amps. It was the Marshalls. As he had problems with his hearing, he did move to smaller amps. In fact, in the latter years, often he was just playing into a tiny little Fender.
Like in the studio, you mean?
Yeah, even live.
Okay.
Even live, he was playing through a Pro Junior half the time. And he had the Marshalls up there just for show.
Really?
Yeah. So it was just might. Emotion to Commotion is amazing because he used a 1954 Champion 600 for the bulk of the stuff in the studio on that. So that's a tiny little primitive amp. That's about as primitive as you can get.
Wow.
And that's what he was using for a lot of the orchestral stuff on that. And and Guitar Shop, he actually had that tour. He brought out a couple Fender Twins. So, and those were the Fender Twin 2s. Actually, they weren't even like 65 black faces, that they were twin reverb 2s that he was mainly using. And it's funny because I'm pretty sure, and just knowing the way studios were in England, and because he was recording at Abbey Road in Air with George Martin, and it was still, even in the mid 70s, it was still the lab coat guys, and they didn't like loud amplifiers. So I'm pretty sure that Blow by Blow was recorded with a Ampeg combo, because there was that BBC performance that he did, and that he did with the band Up, and he's got a little Ampeg combo, and it's like the tone is Blow by Blow. It's the same sound, and like a month later he was recording that album. So I think that's what he brought in the studio with him, because I can't see him bringing this big loud Marshalls into those studios.
I think that's right. The last tour that he played with Johnny Depp, I remember him on stage with a couple of what I think were Marshall combos. Yeah. But I also thought I saw pictures of like a 4x12 cabinet covered with a blanket behind that facing backwards. Yeah. Maybe some different heads. And was he switching?
He would switch. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, he did have the Marshalls up there and he would use them. So I just know that he was starting to favor, around 2010. And again, he may have shifted. Jeff was always changing. And I think around 2015, through 2020, I think he had gone back to using like Marshall half stacks, at least, but in combination with the Fenders and whatever, and then however he felt. But yeah, he did do more amp switching as times went on.
Have you researched like strings that he's used in terms of gauges?
Yeah, boy, I'm trying to remember. I mean, he got into heavier strings later on.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, he was initially into 9s, and I think he was 10s or 11s, as it got later on. As I recall, I'm speaking off memory. I know I have all these notes somewhere.
Yeah.
We didn't get so nerdy in the book with that, because that was kind of one of the criticisms of our Van Halen book, is that we kind of got very guitar nerdy.
That's why I loved it.
Yeah, well, great. But we kind of separated the gear stuff, like I said. I put the guitar stuff in the back.
Yeah.
Book, so it didn't disrupt the flow too much. I mean, I do, whenever we have the chance, we will talk about like he used this on this album, this gear, like Guitar Shop. We mentioned the guitars that he used and on what songs occasionally. If there's any specific detail.
The nerd stuff, it's always exciting. Man, so you're working on this book, promoting it. It comes out July 14th, as I understand it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's really exciting. And besides being an author, what else are you doing these days?
That's pretty much it. It's
Great.
This is like, this book was like a really a very much a focused effort. It was really a couple years of nothing but living, dying Jeff Beck 24/7. Digging through all this information and stuff and trying to make sense out of it. And Brad and I would kind of beat each other up, over all the details, because it's like, he would criticize stuff and I would criticize stuff on his, and I would kick his ass on fact checking stuff, because that's really my thing. And I'm Mr. Documents, photos, digging through databases of concert performances. There was a book that was like a day by day, it's hard to get now, but it was only in print for a little while, but it was like this day by day kind of, almost a diary kind of account of what Jeff Beck's life was, up until I think like 1980, I want to say, I can't remember, but even there I found errors. It's like, no, this wasn't right. This was, but this is, again, a lot of stuff has come to light. That's one of the wonders of the internet, is that we have, old newspapers and things that are available now. So you can go look up, a particular country to see, if this concert happened there, if it was canceled or not, because there's a lot of these databases that you'll find out there that people have a concert date, but it's for a show that was actually canceled. And that's not in notes, but then you go look it up and you find a newspaper and you find out, oh, that show got canceled or whatever. So I would do a lot of that, but it was kind of back and forth. We would find information. We would come across some interview in some far dark corner of the internet, or an interview with somebody that had some illuminating, info to chase. And sometimes it was led to a false path, but other times it was, it led us down an entirely new path that we weren't expecting to go down.
Wow.
But yeah, that's it. I'm focused on that. I do some stuff for Guitar World occasionally, but not as often as I used to. So. And
you play, right? You're a guitarist?
Yeah, I do play as well. Still collect. What's like 140 guitars?
Wow.
80 amplifiers, about 550 guitar pedals, and growing. So.
And where do you live these days?
I live just outside of Manhattan. So.
Oh, nice.
In the suburbs of New Jersey. So I need room for all that gear.
Wow, that's quite a collection.
Yeah.
You'll eventually publish your own book of all of your stuff.
Oh, we'll see.
Coffee table book of Chris Gill.
Yeah. And I actually am doing a lot of work, some stuff on the side with Christie's as well, with the Christie's auction house. So I did help them out a little bit with the Jeff Beck auction, and we're talking about putting together an auction for early next year. Actually, that will be amalgamation of various pop cultural items, so to speak.
Wow, that sounds great. Well, it's been amazing to finally meet you, Chris, and really enjoyed hanging.
It's great.
And finding out more about Jeff is always a good thing for me. So, it's a great chat. And I just wanted to say the book's out again, July 14th. Correct. Everybody should rush out and get a copy. It's kind of a history of rock and roll guitar, really. When you think of how important Jeff Beck was.
He covered all the decades. I mean, it's amazing because, even though he wasn't involved with it, he was involved as a consumer of the rock and roll guitar of the 50s. That's what inspired him and everything. And I mean, he did go back and revisit that. So he does cover the history of rock guitar, really. Yeah.
It's just an amazing subject and so much to talk about. The book's fantastic. I can't wait to get the final edition to see the photographs and stuff. Also, this book here just blew me out. When Jeff died, it really shook me up. Like, unlike any other artist that I can think of, it really, I really love Jeff for whatever reason. His music really got in deep, and I saw that Genesis Publications only had a few editions left, and I got this, and I'm really glad I got it because it's just another way in to see what he was about. We didn't talk about his cars and stuff like that.
No.
I'm sure you saw.
Yeah.
And him being a mechanic and all that. But what a life, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the one thing in the book. We mentioned the hot rods, but we don't go as deep because I think you can't really beat Jeff in that particular book talking about his hot rods, because he just really, that for me, it's like, if you can find a copy of that book, get that. If you're a hot rod, and you want to know about Jeff's association with hot rods, that's the book to get.
There it is.
Because that's, he kind of went into more detail. Like I said, he hired me to write about his guitars. It's like Jeff was kind of blasé about guitars. I mean, Brad just actually, I think, printed something on his Substack with him and Billy Gibbons, and they're talking about guitars and cars, and Jeff's kind of like, guitars are just tools,
Exactly. I think that's how he did see him, right?
Yeah. I got to go up in his attic and see, the guitars, the
wow.
The Oxblood, and that, that 1960 white Strat, and all this stuff. And it was just covered in layers of dust, and it was just like, you could just tell, like, some of the stuff he hadn't picked up for years. In fact, I think the Oxblood hadn't had its strings changed since the mid 70s, since he last played it on, the Blow by Blow tour. So it's just insane.
Yes, it is.
Because we discovered as we dug, there was like some stuff like the Stevie Wonder stories actually are basically what have been told for years. There's a lot of mythology in that. So we debunked that a little bit. We kind of pulled back the curtain. So
the story that I heard about Stevie Wonder was that he went out to lunch and Jeff was playing drums.
Yeah.
And Stevie came back and said, "Oh, keep playing."
Right. And that's not true.
Okay.
According to numerous sources, like Brad did the deep digging on that, but according to Stevie's people, that didn't happen. According to Max Middleton, that didn't happen. It was basically Stevie locked himself up in a room himself and he came out with this thing, and Jeff really didn't have any say so on that. And the other thing was, Jeff, I looked into it, when Jeff said that Stevie played on Thelonious on Blow by Blow.
Right.
He said that Stevie played clavinet on that.
Hmm.
And I looked into that, and it's like, first of all, Jeff didn't mention that until much, much later, in much, much later interviews. I think it starts sometime in the 2000s that he says, "Oh, and Stevie Wonder played on, uncredited on my record." And fortunately, I'd spoken with Phil Chen at one point, and he's like, "I don't remember Stevie playing on that." Max Middleton, same thing. Checked it. Stevie was actually on tour the entire time that the sessions happened. Jeff backpedaled in one interview and said, like, "I had a tape from our sessions, from Looking for Pure Love and, whatever, the sessions I did." And it's like, but how did you get out a tape out of the studio, when you're working for Stevie Wonder, because he had all his people and his handlers there. You ain't walking out of there with a big, huge, multi-track master tape, out of the studio.
Yeah.
Without somebody noticing or going, "Where are you going with that?" or whatever.
Yeah. Unless he was allowed to do that because it was his tape or something. But
yeah, but it doesn't seem. I mean, I guess that could have happened. But and the other thing was like, okay, George Martin he was such a by the book guy.
Yeah,
I couldn't see him allowing an uncredited Stevie Wonder performance.
But you know what I want to say about that is Minnie Riperton's album, the one with the ice cream cone on the cover.
Right.
Stevie wrote many songs on that record for her and played on that record uncredited.
Really?
I think because of his contractual stuff. And I always wondered, I would have never said the clavinet on Blow by Blow. I thought it was maybe the synth line.
Yeah. Well, that's
that thing.
Yeah.
I thought
exactly.
that sounded like Stevie, but
yeah, it's funny because it's like, because people thought maybe the synth bass and whatever, but Max said that was all me.
Wow.
All the synth
Max was amazing, man.
Oh yeah, no, he's amazing. That's the thing. It's like, you listen to the other clavinet parts where he is credited as playing clavinet, and they're every bit as funky as the Stevie Wonder part.
Killing.
So, Carmen claims that he introduced, Jeff to Mahavishnu, and it's like, but Jeff was already aware of Mahavishnu at that point, and John McLaughlin especially. And
yeah, did you see that tour when they toured together?
No, I didn't. No, that was I started going to concerts in '76.
That had to be Jeff's wet dream,
Oh yeah,
to
no, it was. It
work with
was.
John.
Yeah, and John was like, yeah, I interviewed John on that, about that too, and he was just saying what a great time it was, and for them, and just how they bonded and everything, and especially because you know John was still pretty much a jazz guy and everything like that, and he didn't know what to think of this rock guy, and even though he played with Carlos Santana, did the record and everything like that, but that was Carlos, that was a different, they were on a spiritual level.
Yeah.
Whereas Jeff was kind of, he looked like a Rolling Stone member, and everything, had that British.
Yeah, the thing that brought them together, though, is that the fact that they turned up their Marshalls, know.
Yeah.
And the first time I heard Mahavishnu was really funny because I was probably, I don't know, 10 or something. And I was at a friend's house and his older brother had these records. And I said, oh, what are you listening to? He's like, Cream, and he had the live Cream album. And right next to it was Birds of Fire.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, thinking back to that now is like, oh, well, they're just listening to, they're hearing it the same, like Hendrix, Clapton, McLaughlin.
Yeah.
So McLaughlin to me was, kind of hitting that rock thing, right?
Completely. I'd say, yeah, I think I got the first album I got was Apocalypse.
Oh man. That's one of the greatest albums of all time to me.
Yeah, that's what really inspired Jeff to, that's when he just decided, I've got to go do, I've got to do Blow by Blow. I think it was like Apocalypse came out.
Really?
Same time, I forget what it was, which Beck Bogert and Peace record. And
that makes sense.
And Mahavishnu came out at the same date. And Jeff's like, here I am doing this retread, and here's this futuristic sounding thing,
And he reached to George Martin because George did Apocalypse, I think.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. Yeah, it had nothing to do with the Beatles.
Brought the strings in.
It was all because of Apocalypse, yeah.
And who was the engineer on Blow by Blow? Do you remember? It was not Jeff Emmerich.
It wasn't Jeff Emmerich. No, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember, unfortunately. I remember looking up the guy's name.
I asked Brad that too.
Yeah, no, he had some. I have to look it up. Okay, Denham Bridges.
Dude, who is that?
That's exactly, like, we tried to find the guy. I don't even know if he's still alive or not.
Wow.
He hadn't done a whole lot of other stuff too. I looked up his career, and it was kind of, I'm trying to remember because it was a while ago now, but I remember, like, we thought maybe we could talk to this guy and we couldn't find him. But yeah, it was like, that's kind of a little out, of left field, kind of thing.
Yeah, I thought it would be someone we would know.
Yeah, no, Denham Bridges. That's what a hippie name, Denham.
Yeah.
So
never heard of him ever.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
What are your 3 favorite Jeff records?
Oh boy, let's see.
That's hard.
It's a tough one. Probably going to have to go with, Guitar Shop. I just have to say that one because I think that was just for me just hit in the right ways. I
agree.
It was good for Jeff to come back. And Where Were You? I think is just a masterpiece. I think
it is.
That completely changed everything, for Jeff and guitar and whatever. And no one still has done anything like that.
That's right.
So I have to put that in there. I would probably say Truth.
Yeah.
Just because that's the prototype,
Absolutely.
So much of what came afterwards and everything.
And how much does Truth blow you away now when you hear it?
Oh, well, especially it's funny because just a few months ago, I had missed out on, I think there was a remastered version of it. And there was also some extra tracks on it and everything. And I had Truth for so many years. And it's one of those things I thought, I don't really need to get it again. And then I was just looking for the best sounding versions of records and whatever. And I came across this remastered version of Truth. Plus it was expanded with everything. And it sounds amazing. I mean, this remastered version is really like even much like being in the room. It's that well done.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I still like, Ain't Superstitious is just a kind of a thing, but how he does that, even now, it's just like, you don't hear people doing that with a wah-wah,
Yeah, it's really true. It was a different vibe. Not to cut you off on your third pick, but before we go there, One of the things in the book that I loved was that you guys talked about the Yardbirds being the first psychedelic British band. And it totally makes sense to me. And it never occurred to me that they were ahead of the curve and influencing everybody.
But it's funny because I kind of knew that back in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
because I was like, I had a girlfriend who was really into all that psychedelic rock stuff.
Yeah.
And, the LA, psychedelic scene and whatever. We used to go see all the movies at the Revival theaters and everything. And it's like, they're doing a Yardbirds tune. Like that's just, Psychotic Reaction is just a Yardbirds tune, and this is just a Yardbirds tune. And I heard all this stuff and going like, they're just doing the Yardbirds, but it's like, when you look back, it's like, yeah, the Yardbirds came first. It wasn't like they were all part of this whole scene together.
Yeah.
It's like, no, the Yardbirds did this and all these bands copied them, and especially the use of the fuzz box.
Yes.
I'd say that Jeff Beck probably had more influence through the psychedelic rock scene than Keith Richards had. Everyone says like, oh, Satisfaction and sales of the fuzz pedal and all that. But it's like, yeah, but everybody was like trying to copy Heart Full of Soul and Over, Under, Sideways, Down and all this other stuff. And they needed the fuzz box to get that type of singing, tone out of it. And they were doing Jeff Beck stuff.
Yeah. And the same with Jimi Hendrix. I mean, he was influenced by Jeff and came over.
Absolutely.
And got the Marshalls, got the same fuzz pedals, met John Mayer. And
yeah. And it's, that's the thing is that, Jeff was out there, looking beyond the guitar. He was making all these weird sounds.
Yeah.
With the instrument, whether it was doing the train whistle to begin a train kept a rolling, or the percussion stuff, and I'm a Man, or it just goes on and on with all these these sounds that he was doing, sound effects and things like that. That had a huge impact on Hendrix.
No doubt about it. And I read that they were friends over time. And I know Jeff always loved him.
Yeah, and Jeff, it's funny because Carla Olson just reached out to me not too long ago, and said, like, did Jeff ever say anything about, because I guess some friends of hers in Texas had hung out with Jimmy, and Jimmy had told them that Jeff was, his favorite guitar player. And it's like, she said, did Jeff ever say anything about that? And it's like, Jeff would never have said anything about that. Because Jeff was always so modest and so critical of himself. And it's like, he never was one to brag about like, oh, well, Jimi Hendrix says I'm his favorite guitar player. It just wasn't in Jeff's DNA to do that kind of thing. Even if he had heard that, he probably would have even just like brushed it off or, just said, I'm not worthy, of that type of praise from Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah. Some hilarious stories when Hendrix came over though, and did those early gigs, and everybody, Pete Townsend, Jeff, I think clapped, and they were all like, what are we going to do now?
Exactly. But yeah, it was, that was the thing. I think he doesn't get the credit, the Raga Rock thing, the whole Heart Full of Soul thing. It's like that preceded the Beatles doing that type of stuff. And
that's right.
The Kinks might've been around there about the same time, but it's still like, Jeff doesn't get credit for a lot of this stuff. And it's just like, gosh, it really, if you look at the timeline, you realize just what an impact he had. But yeah, the psychedelic rock thing in particular, it was
super
all
impactful.
And even I realized, going further into that, which was kind of a psychedelic rock becomes a metal band, early metal band, Blue Oyster Cult, on your knees is all Yardbirds stuff.
Wow.
Buck's Boogie is Buck Dharma's Jeff's Boogie, basically. I mean, but you listen to On Your Feet or On Your Knees, and it's just like, they do, Maserati GT, I Ain't Got You, Yardbirds. And then they play all these Yardbirds riffs, all throughout that album. And it's just
wow.
And I recognized it at the time, but it's like, people just don't put two and two together and see that.
Well, they don't hear everything, but you have to have those records and know the history a bit,
Yeah, and that's I collect a lot of records, and that's again like it's the Aerosmith thing is a perfect example. Hearing the Train Kept a Rolling riff and realizing that the riff is the Yardbirds. It's not and what the Yardbirds did with what Jeff did with compared to the rock and roll trios, night and day. It's like he kind of what did he do? He supercharged it and he kind of simplified it at the same time. And just turned it into this big, powerful riff, and that fascinated me, as much as anything. And Aerosmith doing it was just like basically they did the Yardbirds thing, you know.
Exactly.
They did two timbre tempos, but when you get to the fast part, they just did the Yardbirds, you know.
But doing that, they brought the Yardbirds back around, and they brought Jeff back around.
True.
And
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool. And, you know, it brings me back to his induction to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I thought was great, where he was wearing all white and had the white Strat, and Jimmy Page came out. And I think at the end of that, they did play with all the guitar players in Aerosmith. They did do that tune. And I feel like Jeff was looking around like, you're blowing it.
Of course he was.
You're fucking this song up.
Yeah. I did want to mention, because I got a little sidetracked talking about the white Strat, because he had a number of white Strats, actually. But there was one that he had from called Anushka, and he had that from like 1999 through, I think, about 2012. That was a custom shop body. Now he swapped necks around a lot on his guitars, so that again, it makes, you know, like I mentioned the pickguard assembly on that 60 Strat and everything, like he was switching stuff around constantly, and that's where I think the hot rod thing comes into play too, because it's just
absolutely,
like, you know, you put a Chevy engine in a Ford or whatever, and you know, that's what Jeff was doing, you know, swapping necks, and doing all this, you know, dropping parts in. But in the latter years, he pretty much had a succession of custom shop Strats. But the common denominator in all of them was actually these John Sewer pickups, which John won't make. He made them for Jeff, and he won't make them for anybody else. And he says, I guess John claims that it's because it has just such an extreme tonal character, I guess an extreme mid-range to it, that people can't deal with it, and they don't know how to deal with it. And also, I guess it's because they are, you know, stacked humbuckers too, and I guess it requires like a deeper cut into the body.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
But I've seen stuff like people talking about, oh, Jeff played, you know, a Fender, you know, signature model with you know, Duncan noiseless pickups or whatever, and it's like, well, no, Jeff didn't do that. All of his guitars were custom made, you know, and you know, even like the roller nut, you know, like they changed roller nuts on them later, and he liked the original Wilkinson ones. So he had those on him, but yeah, all the guitars he played were, you know, unique to him, basically.
Interesting about the pickups. I didn't realize that. Yeah,
most people don't. He only had a few sets of them. I think he had like maybe 3 or 4 sets of them, and he would just take them off one guitar and put them onto the next one. So that was kind of an interesting fact. But yeah, it's everyone says like, oh, his signature model has these Duncan, you know, noiseless on it. It's like, yeah, but that's not what he actually used. So you're not going to, that's why your guitar doesn't sound like Jeff Beck. You know, it's not just because of your fingers, but
you can't get it.
Yeah, you can't get it. It's unobtainable. So.
Wow. What an enlightening hang, man. Thank you.
Sure. Anytime.